They said the tunnel was silent, but silence is never empty, and Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker learned that truth the moment Shadow stopped walking. The wind outside Fort Ridge Military Outpost carried a dry, unsettled hum that morning, brushing across the open terrain like something searching for a place to land, and Ethan stood beside the armored gate with his hands resting loosely on his tactical gloves, watching the world the way a man watches something he no longer fully trusts. Shadow, his German Shepherd canine partner, stood half a step ahead as always, posture steady, ears slightly angled forward, not alert in the way training demanded, but attentive in a way that felt deeper, almost reflective, as if he were listening to something beneath the surface of things. Ethan had known Shadow for 4 years, long enough to stop thinking of him as equipment or protocol and start recognizing the small differences in his moods, the subtle pauses before action, the quiet decisions made in seconds that no one else seemed to notice. That morning, the call had been simple, almost routine, a request to survey a decommissioned access tunnel 3 miles north of the base perimeter, a structure once used for supply movement decades ago, and now sealed off due to structural instability and outdated mapping records. No urgency had been attached to the assignment, just verification, just procedure, just another line on a checklist meant to confirm that nothing remained where nothing was supposed to be. But Shadow had reacted the moment the coordinates were spoken, not with agitation or resistance, but with stillness, a sudden grounding of presence that made Ethan pause mid-sentence, as if the air itself had changed density. Now, standing at the edge of that location, Ethan looked at the tunnel entrance, a wide concrete mouth partially obscured by overgrown brush and weather-worn warning markers faded by time, and he noticed how the light around it seemed to behave differently. Not darker, not lighter, just uneven, like the space was holding its breath. Shadow stepped forward again, then stopped, not waiting for command, not seeking permission, just stopping as though the boundary ahead had already been acknowledged in a language no one had taught him, but he somehow understood anyway. Ethan knelt slightly, running a hand along the leash attachment, feeling the familiar weight of trust between them, and he whispered quietly, almost instinctively, "What are you hearing, boy?" Shadow did not respond in any way that could be explained through training manuals or behavioral charts, but his gaze shifted toward the tunnel again, steady, unwavering, locked onto a point somewhere beyond human sightline. A faint crackle came through Ethan's shoulder radio at that moment, a distortion in the frequency that lasted less than a second, just enough to be noticed, just enough to be wrong, followed by silence so complete it felt intentional. He straightened slowly, scanning the perimeter, confirming what instinct already suggested, that no wind had changed, no machinery had activated, no external interference should have caused that disruption. Yet Shadow had heard it too, because his ears had tilted at the exact instant the static appeared, as if the sound had carried meaning only he was permitted to decode. Ethan took a step forward, then stopped, and for the first time since arriving at Fort Ridge, he felt the weight of uncertainty settle not in his thoughts, but in his chest, a quiet pressure that did not ask for panic, only attention. The tunnel entrance remained unchanged, just concrete, rusted support beams, and the faint outline of darkness stretching inward, but something about it no longer felt like an abandoned structure. It felt occupied in a way that defied explanation, not by presence, but by memory, as though the place itself remembered things it was not supposed to recall. Shadow moved again, this time more decisively, placing one paw forward into the threshold of shadowed ground, then pausing as if waiting for Ethan to align with him, not as handler and unit, but as equal witness to something neither of them had yet understood. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a soldier takes when the line between protocol and instinct begins to blur, and he stepped forward beside him, allowing the leash to loosen just enough to acknowledge that whatever came next would not be controlled by procedure alone. Inside the tunnel, the air shifted immediately, cooler, stiller, carrying a faint metallic undertone that had no clear source, and the light from behind them stretched thin as if reluctant to follow. Shadow did not hesitate now. He simply moved, not rushing, not cautious, but certain in a way that made Ethan trust the direction even before understanding it. The deeper they walked, the more the world outside seemed to recede, not disappearing, but becoming distant, like a memory being placed carefully into storage. And somewhere ahead, beyond the reach of visible light, there was a rhythm forming, not audible yet, not fully present, but implied, like a signal trying to remember how to become sound again, and Shadow was the first to hear it. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, the world outside the entrance collapsed into a narrow memory of light, until even that faded into a soft gray outline behind them, and Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker became aware of how differently sound behaved in this place. Every footstep carried too far, every breath returned slightly delayed, as if the tunnel itself was not just a passage through earth and concrete, but a space that learned echoes and held onto them longer than necessary. Shadow walked ahead now by a few feet, no longer waiting for verbal command, his movements measured but purposeful, head lowered slightly, as if tracking something that did not leave visible traces. Ethan kept one hand near the tactical flashlight mounted on his vest, though he had not activated it yet, trusting the faint ambient glow that filtered from behind them and the subtle contrast of shapes within the tunnel walls. The air grew cooler with each step, not unpleasant, but noticeably different from the surface above, carrying a stillness that felt almost preserved, untouched by time or weather. Somewhere ahead, the faint sound of metal settling against stone reached them, a sound so soft it might have been imagined if Shadow had not stopped immediately in response. Ethan paused as well, watching the K9 freeze mid-step, ears angling forward with intense focus, his entire posture shifting into a state of listening that went beyond ordinary perception. "What is it, Shadow?" Ethan asked quietly, though he knew better than to expect a verbal answer, and the words seemed to dissolve quickly into the tunnel air without resistance. Shadow did not move forward, but he did not retreat either. Instead, he turned his head slightly to the right wall of the tunnel, as if something behind the concrete was calling him without making a sound. Ethan followed his gaze and realized that the tunnel was no longer perfectly uniform. Subtle markings appeared along the surface, faint discolorations that suggested repeated contact or passage long ago, though nothing official in the records had ever mentioned extended use beyond maintenance inspection. The radio on Ethan's shoulder crackled again, this time longer, a distorted pulse of static that rose and fell in uneven rhythm before cutting out abruptly, leaving a silence that felt heavier than before. Ethan frowned, pressing the radio lightly, checking the connection, but there was no response, no interference explanation, only the same emptiness he now felt pressing in from all sides. Shadow took another step forward, slower this time, as if testing the reaction of the space itself, and when nothing changed, he continued, drawing Ethan further into the tunnel without urgency, but with undeniable intent. The passage began to widen slightly, revealing structural reinforcements that looked older than the initial entrance suggested, beams that bore inconsistent markings, some official, some faded, and others that seemed almost improvised, as if added without documentation. Ethan slowed his pace, scanning these details with growing attention, recognizing that this was no longer simply a forgotten utility corridor, but something that had been modified, repurposed, or hidden from standard military records. Shadow suddenly paused again, this time more sharply, his body angled toward a section of wall where the concrete appeared subtly uneven, as if disturbed from behind at some point in the past. Ethan approached cautiously, running his flashlight across the surface for the first time, revealing a faint seam that did not align with any structural blueprint he had seen during briefing, a seam that suggested a sealed opening or maintenance access long since abandoned. The moment the light touched it, Shadow emitted a low, controlled sound, not a bark, not a growl, but something closer to recognition, as if confirming a presence that had been waiting silently on the other side. Ethan's pulse steadied rather than quickened, a strange calm taking hold of him, the kind of calm that often arrived in situations where instinct had already made the decision before logic could interfere. He stepped closer to the wall, placing his palm against the cold surface, feeling nothing unusual at first, only temperature and texture, yet Shadow remained fixed in place, gaze locked, unwavering. Then came the second radio pulse, stronger this time, not random static, but a structured pattern, broken but repetitive, like a signal attempting communication through severe degradation. Ethan lowered the radio slightly, listening carefully, and for a brief moment, he thought he recognized something familiar in the rhythm, not language, not code he had formally studied, but something that resembled repetition used in emergency location beacons. He turned his head slowly toward Shadow, who was now sitting directly in front of the sealed section of wall, calm but fully engaged, as though waiting for confirmation of something already understood. The tunnel around them seemed to tighten in perception, not physically but emotionally, as if attention itself had condensed into this single point. Ethan exhaled quietly and said, almost to himself, "There is something on the other side of this," and Shadow's ears flicked in immediate response, as if agreeing without hesitation. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was expectant, holding the shape of something unfinished, and Ethan realized that turning back was no longer a question of choice, but of timing, because whatever lay beyond that sealed boundary was already aware they had arrived. The moment Ethan Walker stepped closer to the sealed section of the wall, the atmosphere in the tunnel seemed to shift in a way that was not physical but perceptual, as if attention itself had tightened around a single point and refused to move. Shadow remained seated exactly where he was, posture steady, eyes fixed on the same seam in the concrete. But now there was a subtle change in his breathing, slower, controlled, almost as if he was matching his rhythm to something beyond the wall. Ethan kept his flashlight angled low, allowing the beam to skim across the surface without fully flooding it with light, and what he saw made the structure feel less like abandoned infrastructure and more like something intentionally concealed. The seam in the concrete was not uniform. It carried irregular spacing, faint reinforcement marks, and subtle signs that it had been reopened or serviced at some point after its original sealing. He traced the edge carefully with his fingertips, noticing a slight temperature difference, a narrow band where the surface felt marginally warmer than the surrounding material, an anomaly that had no clear environmental explanation given the consistent underground conditions. Shadow gave a quiet exhale, a sound so controlled it was almost inaudible, yet it carried weight, as if acknowledging that Ethan had reached the same conclusion he had already formed without language. Ethan stepped back half a step and glanced down the tunnel behind them, confirming that the path they had taken remained unchanged, still open, still accessible, but now feeling distinctly secondary to what lay ahead. The radio on his shoulder emitted another fragmented pulse, longer than before, structured in a way that suggested intentional repetition rather than random interference, and Ethan's expression tightened slightly as he listened more closely. It was not a recognizable military code, but it followed a rhythm that resembled older emergency beacon patterns, the kind used in outdated systems designed for location tracking in low-visibility environments. He turned his attention back to Shadow, who had now shifted his weight forward slightly, as if preparing for movement, not aggression, not hesitation, but readiness. "You have been hearing this longer than I have, haven't you?" Ethan said quietly, more observation than question, and Shadow's ears flicked once in response, subtle but immediate. The tunnel itself seemed quieter now, as though everything outside this focal point had receded further into distance, leaving only the wall, the signal, and the living awareness standing before it. Ethan knelt slightly and ran the flashlight beam along the seam again, this time noticing something he had missed before, faint scratches or markings embedded into the surface, not natural erosion, but repeated contact points arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate communication or signaling over time. He felt a strange certainty form in his thoughts, not based on evidence alone, but on accumulation of small inconsistencies that no longer aligned with the official description of a sealed utility passage. Shadow rose slowly from his seated position and stepped forward until he was nearly touching the wall, then paused again, tilting his head slightly, as if listening to something just beyond hearing range. The radio emitted another burst of static, but this time Ethan caught something within it, not words, but structure, a repetition that resembled proximity confirmation signals used in search and rescue operations. He lowered the device and looked at Shadow with a measured calm, the kind of calm that forms when uncertainty transitions into action rather than fear, and he said, "There is definitely something alive on the other side of this structure, or something trying to reach us." Shadow responded not with movement, but with stillness, and that stillness carried affirmation rather than doubt. Ethan stood fully now, placing both hands near the seam, scanning its edges for any mechanical latch or access point, but found none visible from the exterior surface. The tunnel lighting from behind them had dimmed further, making the immediate area feel more isolated, as if the environment itself was narrowing focus to encourage decision. Shadow took a single step back, then forward again, a small cycle of motion that communicated anticipation rather than confusion, and Ethan understood that whatever was behind the wall was not random debris or structural anomaly, but something with intent, something that had been waiting long enough for signals to degrade into fragments, yet persist nonetheless. He exhaled slowly and adjusted his stance, shifting weight to prepare for whatever action might come next, while the radio emitted one final pulse, longer and more stable than the previous ones, before falling silent entirely. In that silence, both man and K9 remained fixed on the same boundary, and the only remaining certainty was that whatever existed beyond it had already acknowledged their presence. For several seconds after the final pulse of the radio faded into complete silence, nothing in the tunnel moved except the faint shift of dust in the air, as if even time had paused to observe what was about to happen. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker remained still, eyes locked on the sealed section of the wall, while Shadow stood a few feet ahead, posture unchanged but presence sharpened, every muscle aligned with quiet anticipation. The absence of sound was no longer neutral. It felt intentional, like the environment itself had withdrawn to make space for something that had been waiting far longer than either of them had been present. Ethan slowly lowered his flashlight, letting the beam rest at an angle that traced the seam in the concrete one more time. And in doing so, he noticed a faint vibration, not visible, but perceptible through the surface beneath his palm, a subtle resonance that suggested activity on the other side. He pulled his hand away instinctively, then placed it again, confirming that it was not imagination but a consistent, low-frequency pulse, irregular but persistent, like a signal attempting to stabilize through obstruction. Shadow responded immediately by stepping closer, pressing his nose near the same point, not touching it fully, but close enough that his breathing aligned with the rhythm Ethan had just felt. "You are definitely hearing something I cannot hear," Ethan said softly, his voice calm but measured, as if speaking too loudly might disrupt whatever fragile communication was occurring through the structure. Shadow did not react to the words, but his ears shifted slightly, indicating continued focus beyond the wall. Ethan stepped back and scanned the tunnel again, briefly noting how the lighting behind them had dimmed further, not because of any visible change in equipment, but due to the natural limitation of distance and curvature, creating an increasingly isolated pocket of space where they stood. The sense of enclosure was growing, not physically but perceptually, as if the tunnel had gradually narrowed its attention toward this single sealed point. Ethan retrieved a small diagnostic device from his utility pouch, an older military field receiver used for signal verification, and activated it, watching as the screen flickered with unstable readings that rose and fell in a pattern inconsistent with known interference sources. The device did not provide clarity, but it confirmed structure within the chaos, repeating pulses that suggested intentional origin rather than random degradation. Shadow suddenly shifted his stance, taking a half step backward, then forward again, a motion that Ethan had come to recognize as a form of decision-making in the absence of command, as if the K9 was recalibrating his understanding of what lay beyond. Ethan followed Shadow's line of focus once more and realized that the seam in the wall was no longer the only point of interest. Faint secondary lines extended outward from it, barely visible unless examined closely, forming a subtle geometric arrangement that suggested reinforcement around a concealed access point. He moved the flashlight deliberately along these lines, revealing that they converged in a pattern that could indicate a hatch or maintenance entry sealed from the inside, though no external handle or mechanism was visible. The realization settled in gradually, not as shock, but as alignment of observations, each detail reinforcing the possibility that this tunnel had not been abandoned, but deliberately preserved in silence. Shadow emitted a low, steady breath and placed one paw forward again, this time holding it there longer, as if anchoring himself to the exact point of contact with the structure. Ethan knelt beside him, bringing his face closer to the wall, and for the first time he heard it without equipment, a faint rhythmic distortion, not sound traveling through air, but something transmitted through material itself, like a pulse filtered through dense layers of separation. He closed his eyes briefly to isolate it, and in doing so the pattern became clearer, not in meaning but in structure, a repeating interval that suggested communication rather than decay. When he opened his eyes again, he looked at Shadow and said quietly, "This is not random. This is coordinated." Shadow remained focused, unblinking, as if already accepting that conclusion long before it was spoken. The tunnel behind them remained unchanged, but its psychological weight had shifted. It no longer felt like a passage, but like a threshold with intent on both sides. Ethan stood slowly, placing one hand flat against the wall once more, and this time he did not withdraw it immediately, instead allowing himself to remain in contact long enough to feel the subtle irregularity beneath the surface stabilize into a consistent rhythm. Shadow stepped closer and aligned himself directly beside Ethan, both facing the same point, neither moving, neither retreating, and in that shared stillness there was an understanding forming that whatever lay beyond was not merely hidden, but actively maintaining presence, waiting for the exact moment when recognition would become possible. The moment Ethan Walker and Shadow stood aligned in front of the sealed wall, something subtle changed in the atmosphere of the tunnel, not in temperature or structure, but in presence, as if the space itself had adjusted to acknowledge that observation had become mutual. The faint rhythmic distortion beneath Ethan's palm stabilized further, no longer fluctuating randomly, but forming a consistent interval that repeated at precise, measured gaps, like a heartbeat reduced to its most minimal expression. He withdrew his hand slowly, studying the surface again under the angled beam of his flashlight, and realized that the vibration was strongest at a very specific point within the seam, a location no larger than the width of his palm. Shadow remained still beside him, but his attention was no longer only forward. His head tilted slightly, as if triangulating something that extended beyond physical structure. Ethan reached for his diagnostic receiver once more, holding it closer to the wall, and watched as the unstable readings began to organize themselves into a clearer pattern, still fragmented but undeniably structured, confirming that the signal was not random interference, but a repeating transmission attempting persistence through obstruction. He lowered the device and exhaled slowly, then spoke in a quiet tone. "This is not just residual energy or environmental noise. This is intentional repetition." Shadow responded not with movement, but with a subtle shift in posture, as if agreeing without needing translation. Ethan stepped half a pace to the left, scanning the seam again, and noticed that the faint geometric lines he had observed earlier were more defined from this angle, converging toward a central point that suggested controlled engineering rather than natural degradation. He followed the convergence with his flashlight, revealing a barely perceptible indentation within the concrete, too precise to be accidental, too consistent to be erosion, and he realized that what they were facing was likely a concealed access interface integrated into the wall itself. Shadow suddenly moved closer to that exact point, placing his nose within inches of the surface, and then paused, holding perfectly still as if listening through material rather than air. Ethan crouched beside him, lowering his center of gravity to align with the canine's focus, and in that position he became aware of something he had not noticed before, a faint variation in pressure along the wall, not enough to suggest movement, but enough to suggest containment. The realization formed gradually rather than abruptly, that whatever lay beyond this barrier was not dormant in the traditional sense, but active in a constrained way, maintaining function within limits that were no longer fully visible from this side. The tunnel behind them remained silent, but the silence now felt structured, as if it had been arranged deliberately to preserve concentration. Ethan placed his hand again on the seam, this time applying slightly more pressure, and immediately felt the same rhythmic response, stronger now, as if proximity had amplified recognition. Shadow shifted his weight forward in response, and for the first time since entering the tunnel, he emitted a sound, not loud, not urgent, but steady, like a low acknowledgement of confirmation rather than alarm. Ethan turned his head toward him and said quietly, "You are certain about this, aren't you?" And Shadow remained fixed on the same point, unmoving, unwavering, as if certainty had already been established long before human interpretation caught up. The diagnostic receiver in Ethan's other hand emitted one final organized pulse, longer and more stable than any prior reading, and then abruptly ceased all activity, leaving only silence and the faint residual vibration beneath his palm. Ethan lowered the device completely and looked at the sealed wall with a steady gaze, no longer treating it as a barrier of unknown origin, but as a threshold that was actively maintaining a state of communication. Shadow took one deliberate step forward and stopped exactly at the center of the convergence point, positioning himself as if marking location rather than reacting to it. And in that stillness, there was an unmistakable sense of confirmation that whatever lay beyond was not only present, but aware of them in return. The moment the diagnostic silence settled completely, it felt less like the end of a signal and more like the beginning of something waiting for acknowledgement, and Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker remained motionless in front of the sealed wall with Shadow standing precisely at the convergence point, as if both of them had been positioned there by something that existed beyond instruction or chance. The faint rhythmic vibration beneath the surface had not disappeared, but it had changed character, no longer fluctuating or unstable, now holding a steady interval that repeated with a precision that suggested intentional control rather than mechanical failure. Ethan slowly lowered his flashlight, allowing the beam to rest against the lower edge of the seam, and noticed that the light itself seemed to behave differently at this exact point, not bending or reflecting in a visible way, but appearing slightly muted as though the surface absorbed more than it should. Shadow's posture remained fixed, but his breathing had slowed further, synchronized in a way that was not trained but instinctive, and Ethan found himself observing that synchronization with increasing attention. He placed his hand again on the wall, this time without hesitation, and immediately felt the same structured pulse, stronger now, almost like a confirmation response rather than a passive signal. It did not feel like something transmitting outward. It felt like something acknowledging contact. Ethan exhaled slowly and said under his breath, "This is not just communication, this is response behavior." And the words seemed to settle into the tunnel without echo, as if the environment itself had absorbed them. Shadow shifted slightly, adjusting his stance so that his shoulder aligned closer to Ethan's leg, maintaining contact proximity without breaking focus from the sealed point. The tunnel behind them remained unchanged, yet its silence had become heavier, not in volume but in density, as though the absence of sound now carried structure of its own. Ethan retrieved his diagnostic receiver again, though he did not expect it to function differently, and when he activated it, the screen displayed a pattern that had simplified further, no longer chaotic or fragmented, but reduced to a repeating sequence of pulses that appeared to stabilize in intervals of exact consistency. He studied it carefully, recognizing that such stabilization was not typical of signal degradation or environmental interference, but more consistent with controlled transmission attempting to maintain coherence through obstruction. He lowered the device and turned his attention back to the wall, now viewing it less as a physical barrier and more as a medium separating two synchronized systems. Shadow suddenly moved his head closer to the seam, pausing at a point just above Ethan's hand, and for a brief moment both remained perfectly still, as if listening to the same frequency through different sensory pathways. Ethan felt a subtle shift in pressure against his palm again, but this time it was accompanied by a faint variation in rhythm, a slight alteration that suggested acknowledgement of proximity change. He withdrew his hand slowly, and the rhythm adjusted immediately, returning to its previous pattern, reinforcing the impression that the system beyond the wall was reacting in real time. Ethan stepped half a pace backward and observed Shadow carefully, noticing how the canine's focus had intensified rather than relaxed, his entire posture communicating sustained attention rather than curiosity. The tunnel air remained cool and still, but it now carried a sensation of expectation, as if the space itself had entered a phase of readiness. Ethan spoke again in a low, controlled tone. "Whatever is behind this structure is maintaining active coordination, and it knows we are here." And Shadow's ears flicked once in response, confirming awareness without distraction. The diagnostic device emitted a final brief pulse, sharper than before, then abruptly shut down entirely, leaving only silence and the faint residual vibration beneath the concrete surface. Ethan looked at it for a moment, then returned it to his vest without reaction, accepting its failure not as loss, but as confirmation that external tools were no longer sufficient to interpret what was occurring. Shadow remained positioned at the center of the convergence point, unmoving, but fully engaged, as if anchoring himself to the exact location where communication was strongest. Ethan lowered his gaze to the seam once more, and in that moment he understood that they were no longer investigating an unknown structure, but standing at the boundary of a controlled exchange that had been ongoing long before their arrival, and that their presence had now become part of its continuation. The silence that followed the shutdown of the diagnostic device did not feel empty anymore, but complete, as if the tunnel had sealed off not only external sound, but also the expectation of interference, leaving Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker and Shadow inside a space that now functioned under its own internal logic. The faint rhythmic vibration beneath the sealed wall had stabilized into a pattern so consistent it no longer felt like a signal, attempting communication, but rather a maintained state of awareness, like something on the other side had settled into recognition of sustained contact. Ethan stood motionless for several seconds, allowing his senses to recalibrate without technological assistance, and realized that even without instruments, the structure still communicated through subtle variations in pressure and tone that could be felt more than heard. Shadow remained at the convergence point, his posture unchanged, but there was a noticeable refinement in his focus, as if his perception had narrowed further into a single channel of input. Ethan lowered his gaze and spoke quietly, not as a command, but as a reflection. "We are not the first to stand here," and the words seemed to align with the environment rather than interrupt it. Shadow responded by shifting his head slightly toward the seam, maintaining proximity without touching, as though respecting a boundary that was both physical and conceptual. The tunnel air remained cool and still, but Ethan noticed a subtle variation in airflow near the sealed section, not a draft, but a controlled absence of movement, as if the space behind the wall regulated its own pressure independently. He stepped half a pace closer and placed his palm near the surface again, this time without expectation of change. Yet the moment contact was re-established, the rhythmic pulse responded immediately, not increasing in intensity, but adjusting in structure, as if acknowledging re-engagement. Ethan withdrew his hand slowly and observed that the rhythm did not fade, but continued at a steady interval, suggesting that the system behind the wall maintained continuity regardless of intermittent contact. Shadow suddenly lifted his head slightly higher, ears angling forward with precise attention, and Ethan noticed that the K9's breathing had shifted again into a slower cadence, synchronized with the established interval beneath the wall. For a brief moment, Ethan closed his eyes, not to block sensory input, but to isolate it, and in that absence of visual reference, he became aware of a faint layered structure within the rhythm, as though multiple sequences were overlapping in controlled repetition. When he opened his eyes again, he looked at Shadow and said softly, "This is layered transmission, not single source output." And Shadow remained still, confirming understanding through presence rather than movement. The tunnel behind them remained unchanged, yet its psychological weight had increased, as if distance itself had become less relevant than alignment. Ethan turned his attention back to the seam and traced its outline once more with his flashlight, noticing that the faint geometric convergence he had observed earlier now appeared more defined, almost symmetrical when viewed from his current angle. He followed the pattern downward and realized that it suggested not only a concealed access point, but a designed interface intended for recognition under specific conditions rather than forced entry. Shadow shifted his stance slightly, stepping closer to Ethan's position rather than the wall, and for the first time since entering this section of the tunnel, he looked briefly up at Ethan instead of forward, a glance that carried acknowledgement rather than urgency. Ethan met his gaze and understood that the K9 was no longer simply reacting to environmental cues, but actively participating in interpretation of the same unseen structure. The rhythmic pulse beneath the wall continued uninterrupted, steady and deliberate, and Ethan noticed that it no longer felt external, but shared, as if the boundary between observation and response had begun to dissolve. He lowered his flashlight and allowed the tunnel to fall into near darkness around them, relying instead on perception of movement and pressure rather than sight. In that reduced visibility, the system behind the wall felt more present, not through illumination, but through continuity of rhythm that seemed to extend beyond material separation. Shadow remained aligned with the convergence point, perfectly still, as if holding position within an invisible framework that both of them were now part of, and Ethan realized that whatever was on the other side was no longer simply signaling for attention, but waiting for completion of a pattern that required their presence to resolve. The tunnel felt different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because the relationship between silence and perception had shifted into something more structured, as if the environment itself had entered a sustained state of readiness. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker remained standing at the sealed wall with Shadow positioned slightly ahead of him, both aligned toward the same convergence point where the rhythmic pulse beneath the surface continued with unwavering precision. The pattern was no longer interpreted as signal or interference in Ethan's mind. It had become a form of communication that existed independently of language, sustained through repetition and recognition rather than transmission strength. He slowly lowered his flashlight until it pointed toward the ground between them, allowing the tunnel to exist in near darkness, and immediately noticed that the absence of light did not diminish perception, but enhanced sensitivity to the subtle variations in pressure and rhythm that filled the space. Shadow did not move, but his posture reflected heightened awareness, every muscle held in quiet coordination, as if maintaining alignment with an unseen counterpart beyond the wall. Ethan spoke softly, his voice controlled and steady. If this is a system, then it is responding to continuity, not interruption, and the words seemed to settle into the tunnel without echo, absorbed rather than reflected. Shadow's ears shifted slightly, acknowledging the statement without breaking focus. The rhythmic pulse beneath the wall continued without deviation, but Ethan now recognized a secondary layer beneath it, a slower, deeper interval that suggested a hierarchical structure within the signal, as though multiple cycles were operating simultaneously at different depths of stability. He reached forward again, not touching immediately, but hovering his hand near the surface, and felt the familiar response begin almost instantly, the vibration adjusting not in intensity, but in alignment, as if calibrating itself to his proximity. Shadow stepped closer as well, reducing the distance between them and the sealed wall to a minimal threshold, and for a moment both man and K9 stood in complete synchronization with the pattern beneath the concrete. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, isolating sensation, and in that absence of sight, he perceived the rhythm more clearly, not as sound or vibration alone, but as layered timing intervals that repeated with deliberate consistency. When he opened his eyes, he looked at Shadow and said quietly, "This is not reactive anymore. It is sustained coordination." And Shadow remained still, his focus unchanged, as if the distinction had already been understood without words. The tunnel behind them felt increasingly distant despite no physical movement, as if attention itself had narrowed the world to this single point of interaction. Ethan adjusted his stance and traced the seam again with his flashlight, now noticing that the geometric convergence lines were not only symmetrical but also directional, forming a subtle orientation toward a specific central axis within the wall. He followed that axis downward and realized that the structure was not simply sealed, but designed to hold alignment under specific conditions of recognition, suggesting that access was not mechanical but conditional, dependent on pattern matching rather than force or tools. Shadow suddenly shifted his weight slightly forward, then stopped again, maintaining exact position at the convergence point, and Ethan noticed that the K9's breathing had now fully synchronized with the deeper interval beneath the surface, steady and controlled. The rhythmic pulse continued uninterrupted, but its presence now felt integrated into their shared space rather than separated by material boundary. Ethan lowered his hand completely and stepped half a pace back, observing the wall not as an obstacle, but as an interface maintaining active equilibrium. The tunnel remained silent and sound, but not in communication, and for the first time Ethan understood that silence here was not absence, but structure maintained through continuous response. Shadow remained fixed in position, fully engaged with the unseen system beyond the wall, and Ethan realized that whatever lay on the other side was not waiting passively, but actively sustaining connection through their presence. holding the pattern in balance until the final condition for transition was met. The moment settled into a silence that felt no longer like absence, but completion, as if every previous layer of uncertainty inside the tunnel had condensed into a single point of alignment between Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker, Shadow, and the sealed structure before them. The rhythmic pulse beneath the concrete remained steady, but now it carried an unmistakable sense of resolution, no longer adjusting or recalibrating, but holding a fixed pattern that suggested readiness rather than observation. Ethan stood motionless for several seconds, studying the wall with a calm that came not from certainty, but from acceptance that traditional analysis no longer applied. Shadow remained at the convergence point, perfectly still, his presence anchored directly in front of the seam where all previously detected patterns had intersected. Ethan slowly lowered his flashlight until it was angled toward the floor, allowing the tunnel to exist in near total darkness, and immediately noticed that perception did not diminish but sharpened, as though the absence of light allowed other forms of awareness to become dominant. The vibration beneath the surface intensified slightly, not in strength but in coherence, and Ethan realized that it was no longer simply responding to proximity, but to sustained presence from both sides of the boundary. He exhaled slowly and spoke in a quiet, steady voice. "It is maintaining equilibrium based on our position," and the words seemed to integrate into the tunnel rather than disturb it. Shadow's ears flicked once in response, subtle and precise, confirming continued alignment without breaking focus. The air around them felt still, but not static. It carried a controlled tension, like a system holding itself in suspension while awaiting final interaction conditions. Ethan adjusted his stance slightly, planting his feet more firmly, and placed his hand near the seam once again, this time not testing or probing, but confirming consistency. The response was immediate and stable, the rhythm beneath the surface locking into a sustained interval that no longer fluctuated at all. It was not increasing or decreasing, it was holding, as if recognizing completion of a necessary condition. Shadow suddenly stepped half a pace forward, then stopped exactly at the same point of alignment, and Ethan noticed that the K9's breathing had become perfectly steady, synchronized with the underlying pulse in a way that appeared fully resolved rather than adaptive. For a moment, Ethan allowed his eyes to close, not to escape perception, but to isolate the sensation completely, and in that absence of sight, he understood that the system beneath the wall was no longer transmitting information outward, but maintaining a locked state of recognition that required continuity rather than interruption. When he opened his eyes, he looked at Shadow and said quietly, "We are not observing this anymore. We are part of its condition," and Shadow remained still, fully present, as if acknowledging that distinction without need for confirmation. The tunnel behind them felt even more distant now, not physically, but perceptually, as though their entire field of awareness had been compressed into the narrow space between hand, wall, and presence. Ethan lowered his flashlight completely, letting it hang unused, and in the darkness he could still perceive the structure through pressure, rhythm, and alignment alone. The seam in the concrete no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a boundary maintaining communication integrity between two states of existence. Shadow's posture shifted slightly again, not in reaction but in affirmation, holding position directly at the convergence point with unwavering focus. Ethan sensed that whatever lay beyond the wall was no longer searching or signaling, but maintaining a sustained interface state that required synchronization rather than intrusion. He stepped back half a pace, not breaking contact with awareness, and observed that the rhythmic pulse remained unchanged, perfectly stable, as if the system had reached a final equilibrium state. In that moment, Ethan understood with quiet clarity that the tunnel was not concealing something waiting to be found, but sustaining something that had already been acknowledged, and that their presence had completed the condition necessary for continued connection.